So, without further ado, let's get into this case. We covered at the end of last year Giselle Pellico's case. Her husband, Dominique, was convicted in December of 2024 of drugging her, essaying her, as well as inviting dozens upon dozens of men to come and essay her while she was unconscious as well. 49 of the 50 men who were on trial were convicted. Dominique Pellico received 20 years. That was the maximum sentence. 20 years for his crimes. That was labeled the largest mass essay case in France at the time. Then this case came along. Joël Le Scouarnec, and I hope I'm pronouncing that right. This is now the largest case of child SA that has ever been done in France. It may even beat out the US. I didn't look into that, but there are nearly 300 victims who are under 16. Actually, I think it's under 15, or it's 15 and under. That's why I put 16 on my thumbnail. Hey, Seventh, how you doing? Just let that sink in for a minute. Nearly 300 victims who were named for this case. I want to talk about today with his case. The reason I brought it up, it is Sexual Assault Awareness Month. And although this happens in France, I wanted to bring this to your attention to just show the global scale of what we're dealing with pedophiles. I can say that because I'm not monetized yet. And he truly is a pedophile, and he admits that he's a pedophile. This case, Carmel, if you're speaking of Dominique Pellico, I'm going to do an update on that. Yes, his daughter has brought charges. He was convicted of having photographs, indecent photographs of his daughter. She was also apparently drugged because she was unconscious, or at least it seems unconscious. She says she's a light sleeper, and she would have noticed if she was moved. She normally doesn't sleep on her left side, which is how she was posed. And she's brought separate charges for SA. We'll see what becomes of that. As of right now, he has denied it, and we don't know what's going to happen. But he was convicted in the trial in September that involved his wife of having those pictures. This is just a new suit for actual SA. So we'll see what becomes of that. But this case was brought, the trial started February 24th. So this is very recent, and it's going to continue. My knowledge of the French legal system is very, very limited. Victims can choose to have anonymity. They do not have to be named specifically. They can be given pseudonyms, or as Giselle Pellico did, they can choose to have the details of their case be public. Right now, I do not know that anybody has chosen for it to be public, other than a few victims, I believe, testified, used their real names, but the statute of limitations had run for their cases. So they were there more as a witness, or in the US, what we would call prior bad acts. So showing that it happened before, that this was his modus operandi, or there was some sort of signature, some reason that connects these past cases to the cases that they're actually charging on. So those ones, they didn't actually charge the ones that used their real name, to my knowledge. A few of them used their first name, which I do believe is their real first name, but did not identify themselves specifically. And that's why I was unable to bring a photograph to you, because the only pictures of Joel are just watercolor paintings, artist drawings of people who were journalists who were actually at the trial. This case really goes to show the reforms that are needed in France in regards to their legal system. And it highlights, just as the Dominique Pellicot case did, impressions matter. He was a surgeon, a very well-respected doctor, and despite even some other doctors coming forward and mentioning some things, he retained his job. Nothing was ever made public. So that's part of the reason why he was able to get away with it for so long. Sorry, if I look down, I've got some notes. He's currently 74. He retired in 2017. I believe he was a doctor for well over 30 years. The charges in this case stem from 1989 to 2014. That's a long time, a very long time. This is not his first brush with the law. There was an FBI investigation done of an international network. It was called Operation Falcon. And he was caught up in part of that. And in 2005, he was convicted of possessing child pornography. And he was sentenced to a 4-year suspended sentence, which means he did not serve prison time. His work was not notified about his conviction. He was not required to have a psych eval. He was not required to be followed up with by the court system that I was able to find. And so although some other doctors did bring this conviction to the attention of the organization that was in charge, the physicians organization, it'd be kind of like similar to the AMA here, the American Medical Association, they brushed it off. They said there was no evidence of, I want to get this, there's no evidence of physical aggression in regards to the conviction. So he was just convicted of possessing the child pornography on his computer. There was a lack of doctors. And they said, by all accounts, he was a kind and well-respected doctor. And therefore, they did nothing. The organization did nothing. Now, there is going to be a civil lawsuit in this case for the victims for monetary damages, for them to recoup monetary damages. The organization that is in charge of the physicians has actually is going to be a part of that civil suit. They are outraged now that he was allowed to continue working with patients. And you'll see why when I talk about this. I see the numbers in the chat, and we're quite low, and I can understand that. This is not a nice thing to talk about, but I think we have to, because this happens in the United States. People who are well respected, and even if things seem off, it tends to get brushed under the rug because, oh, they couldn't possibly do that. They're so nice. They're so polite. They give back to the community. They are in a well-respected career, profession. We don't want to see it. It's the same as with my situation when I finally came forward at 11 and tried to tell, and my mom, she didn't want to see it. It wasn't that she didn't want to believe me. I know that now. It's this ostrich effect. It's too horrible to want to grasp. We don't want to believe this is happening in our community. But it is. And all you need to do is look at the Dominique Pellico case, that in his small little southern town of Mazan, he was able to get 50 men to come over and essay his wife while she was unconscious. I mean, I don't have a breakdown of how far they traveled, but by all accounts, this was, he was not pulling people from Paris. He wasn't, these were fairly local people. And the people convicted in that case were anywhere from age 22 to age 70. So it's not as if we're looking at a specific demographic for the assaulter. This is spanning generations, which says that the message has not gotten to the younger generations of this is not okay. Consent is a thing. And this happens in the United States as well. It just so happens that these two cases are in France, and they're just so horrific that it's easy to use them as an example. Now, in Le Scouarnec's case, he used his profession to cover up a lot of the assaults that he did. He did them under the guise of a medically necessary procedure, whether that be a rectal exam or a gynecological exam. He was very careful never to cause pain, never to leave physical marks on the people. He chose his victims very carefully, as most pedophiles do. Never did it when family was visiting or when he knew other doctors or nurses were due to come in, because a lot of his crimes were committed in the hospital. And in fact, a vast majority of his victims were under the effects of anesthesia in the operating room when this happened. Now, how he was able to get them alone in the operating room, I haven't a clue. Under the effects of anesthesia, say after the operation, if they're in recovery or something, I can see that more. So a lot of the victims had no idea. I should say a lot of the survivors had no idea that they were victims of this man. They only knew, and of the ones that I've read accounts of, that they had, anxiety, they had depression, they had eating disorders, they had a fear of the medical profession, and they didn't know why. Behaviors started to change. And we've talked about this. These are things we need to look for. If they go from behaving one way to behaving another, we need to dig deeper with that person. We need to find out, hey, did something happen? Why is there the split of what happened before to what happened after? And when I say, this is not limited to France, you only need to look at the Larry Nassar case, which he was based out of my state, Michigan. He was a doctor for a long, long time, involved in sports, gymnastics, and under the guise of a medical procedure, essayed hundreds of girls. Now, Le Scouarnec was not limited just to girls. He chose men and, or I should say, boys and girls. The average age, however, was 11, but the age range of his victims was 1 to 70. Now, the extreme ends of those, there were much fewer numbers that we know of. Like I said, it was over 250 were 15 and under. So he definitely preferred the young. Hey, Davey, how you doing today? So thankfully, the man was taken off the streets eventually. He retired, like I said, in 2017 from his profession. Shortly thereafter, a 6-year-old girl did come forward and said that she had been sexually assaulted. And the sexual assaults that occurred that he's being charged with run the gamut, from touching to penetration. So there's, we're not talking about just one specific act. There's a lot of different acts that he's been charged with, for the victims. So the 6-year-old came forward and an investigation was launched. They found eventually charging him with, I'm not sure how many counts it was, but there were 4 victims. A patient, the 6-year-old girl who was a neighbor, I do believe, and 2 nieces of his. And in December 2020, he was convicted of those and he was given a 15-year sentence. So at the time these charges were brought, he was already in prison. The reason these charges were brought was because of things that they found as a result of the investigation that occurred once the 6-year-old brought charges. So bless the parents or whoever of the 6-year-old that got this ball rolling and got this guy off the streets, because I have no doubt in my mind that just because he had retired from his profession that he wouldn't continue to do this. He just would have to look to a different pool of people. And I don't know, I know the 6-year-old, her accusations, well, now proven, the acts that he committed against her were after he retired. I do believe the ones with the nieces were after they retired, but don't quote me on that. And like I said, one was a patient, so that must have been before he retired. So in 2020, he's given 15 years and he's locked up. But in investigating the allegations at the time, of the 2020 case, they searched his house and they seized electronic devices, as they often do. And they found thumbnails and, hard drives, as well as notebooks. And all of that information really was the foundation of this current case. That's where they got these nearly 300 victims from. And when I say that some of these people, some of these now survivors, didn't know that they were victims, it was the police who told them. And it's because they found the information in Le Scouarnec's own handwriting. He kept notebooks. For over 30 years, he kept diaries and detailed every single sexual assault that he did. He denied a lot of this, and at the beginning of the trial. However, on March 20th, he finally did admit to all of the acts that he's been charged with. Like I said, The information I was able to glean is that the trial is still ongoing. They expect that it's going to be going on until June. I was not able to find that the trial would be cut short because he now has admitted in court that, yes, I'm guilty of these. In the US, the trial would be shut down and they would take his guilty plea, and you wouldn't have to present the rest of the evidence that you have. But in France, it doesn't seem to be the case. Yeah, and this is not a one-time occurrence, too, with finding that pedophiles or predators write their crimes down or record them visually with either pictures or video now. That was how they were able to get Dominique Pellico. He had hundreds of thousands of images on his computer and videos detailing all of these essays. It's their trophy, it's their way of being able to go back to it and relive it and feel that excitement of that situation again. Hi, Don. How are you doing? Please take care of yourselves, guys. I know this is not a nice subject to talk about, but we cannot give people passes because they don't seem like the type. In Dominique Pellico's case, the assaulters that he was able to get were firefighters, were teachers, were, they were just normal, everyday people. And it sparked really what was the equivalent of the Me Too movement here in the United States, especially by Giselle coming forward and essentially is the face of that movement now. To my knowledge, she's not an activist, though. She has just gone back to her life. But she certainly is the face of the movement, having kicked this off. And now with this case, on the heels of the Dominique Pellico case, who is facing a maximum of 20 years in prison. 20 years for what ends up will most likely be 300 victims. Because during the trial, he admitted after the testimony of one of his sons that, yes, he did essay his granddaughter. Now, there was conflicting testimony in terms of whether the wife knew about his pedophilia. She denies it. She says she had no clue and never saw, any indication of it. Apparently, even after his 2005 conviction of possessing child pornography. I don't know how you bury your head in the sand after that. But other members of the immediate and the extended family said, no, she knew. Why they say that, I don't know. The articles that I read did not get into depth. I was not able to locate anyone who had actual transcript of testimony. And that is because this is not a publicized case in terms of, the victims being public. So that is anonymous. So we have only the reportings of those who were at trial. Hi, James. Divorce immediately. Yeah, Davey, I don't know that I could stay. When in 2020, when they launched the investigation, they ended up finding over 300,000 images and video of child pornography. I think slash and or pornography. I'm not 100% sure on that number as to whether it included some just regular, quote unquote, legal pornography. But the stuff that he did have that I believe was legal was extremely violent. This was not a man who, I don't want to say was an ordinary pedophile, but he was into a lot of stuff. And by the admissions in his notebook, he was into just about everything. I won't go into detail. I won't list everything, but if you can imagine it, he was probably for it. And he said, I'm a monster. I'm a pervert. I'm a pedophile. Supposedly, he said these urges came about when he was like 35. No explanation as to why they would suddenly surface then. I have my doubts that it just suddenly surfaced at age 35. Maybe he, at age 35, just got his hands on his first child pornography. And that kind of lit a fire under him in terms of acting on his feelings. But I'm really doubting that he only started having these feelings at age 35. Hi, Kim, no problem. Go ahead and get some sleep. Carmel says the French attitude against sexual predators is very lax. Roman Polanski still lives there, and Marlon Brando was never charged over there. Hi, Bobo. Thanks for joining us this evening. Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why this movement, I really hope, does not lose steam. There have been calls. I was looking at just some French news. There's a French member of parliament over there they're calling for him to be arrested on charges of sexual assault using chemical submission, which is drugging somebody. I don't know the details of that case, so I can't speak to it with any sort of confidence. But I really hope that this does not lose steam. There was a push in Belgium after several people were, well, really only one was charged, Marc Dutroux, and it sparked a huge protest and uprising. But unfortunately, it never went anywhere. It just kind of died. And I am hoping that it doesn't take, that's not the case here. I mean, to be facing only a maximum of 20 years in prison with 300 victims, do the math. Basically, how many months per victim is that? It's nothing. So there are several people who've kind of taken up the banner and have become activists within this. Dominique Pellico's daughter, Carolyn Darian, which is her married name, has become an activist. She started a nonprofit for survivors of chemical submission. She's got her case that she wants to move forward, and she's very involved in the movement. And I can only hope and pray that it goes further. I did not look up if you were facing the same charges here in the U.S., like say in the United States, what that would be. Very unlikely you would have federal charges for that unless you had brought all the kids over state lines or there was some other reason for federal charges. Most often these are going to be state charges. And so those laws vary state to state. And some places you're going to receive harsher sentences than others. But from what I know, on the whole, if you were charged with this number, it would be significantly more. the problem also becomes about the sentencing is that even if you're sentenced to 20 years per victim, you're allowed then to serve those sentences concurrently, which means you're serving those sentences all at the same time. So you're still only looking at 20 years in prison. It's not until we get to consecutive sentencing, which means you have to serve one and then the other. And in the US, there's only certain circumstances that are allowed to be served consecutively. The default is concurrently. Interesting enough, felon carrying a firearm is an automatic 2-year in Michigan, is an automatic 2-year consecutive sentence. Why they don't make crimes involving SA, involving children, automatically consecutive, I don't know. Particularly children. I mean, you're talking about the most vulnerable of the vulnerable. Hey, Misha. Thanks for stopping by. Appreciate you being here tonight. It truly is mind-boggling. Krista says, and shaving off some time for good behavior. And again, that varies by state. Some states have gotten rid of the good behavior time. Federal, I do believe, does not have good behavior time. I do not believe Florida does either. Don't quote me on that, though. So again, state by state. And as I stated at the beginning, my knowledge of the French legal system was very, very limited. I've tried to, find anybody in France. I don't have any subs who are from France. Some around the area in the European Union, but nobody actually in France. But what is known is that their attitude, at least before these two cases, as Krumel said, was fairly lax. Their rape culture was very much one of blame the victim, bury your head in the sand, don't look too carefully, boys will be boys type of attitudes. All those stereotypes and things that we have been fighting against in the US for years. So with 300 victims, I hope that they're able to bring some legislation reform. With Dominique Pellico and Joël Le Scouarnec, it just brings to the forefront that this is not atypical. These are atypical cases because you're involving such large numbers. But do we think that they are the anomaly? I don't think so. But there are many pedophiles who get away with their crimes for years and years and years and years. So it's incumbent upon us to ask questions, to not look at the medical profession or any other profession as being someone being beyond reproach. These predators exist everywhere. They are of every age, they are of every gender, they are of every sexual orientation, they are in every different profession. They are ordinary people. But that's the reason these two were able to get away with their crimes for so long, was because they were looked at so highly in their society. I know with Dominique Pellico's case in particular, that some of the people who were either victims, because he did have other victims of, which he's been brought up on charges now for, as well as one murder, actually. Some of the family members, they didn't want to say anything, one out of fear of bringing strife to the family, but also of not feeling like they wouldn't be believed because this person was so well respected in the community. We have to suspect them. We have to bring our voice. By speaking your truth, it may bring pain to a lot of people. That's true. Families are destroyed by this. But don't those victims, those past and those future victims, potential future victims, don't they deserve that protection? I think they do. And so we cannot be afraid to speak up. Now, that doesn't mean if you have a suspicion, you announce it from the rooftop or you go onto social media. We don't want to irrevocably ruin someone's reputation on something that ends up being unfounded. Because once that's out there, that's really hard to take back. Even if it's proven to be false later, that type of moniker, it sticks. It's just outrageous. The whole thing is outrageous. Hi, Amelia. How you doing today? Yeah, it does. It happens more than you think. And Crystal, your case is a prime example of, Canadian laws. They need to be changed. From what I have seen of cases that I've looked at, your sentences are incredibly light. I think that they've gotten stronger in the last decade, but even in the US, say 20 years ago, you get a slap on the wrist. Nowadays, with possession of child pornography, they're getting stricter. But interestingly enough, the stronger piece of the law is the illicit use of electronic equipment. It doesn't matter what the illicit use is. It's not the fact that you're possessing child pornography. It's the fact that you are using your computer for an illicit purpose that gets you a harsher sentence. To me, that's wackadoodle. And while I appreciate the fact that there is another charge that can be brought that brings a stronger sentence for these predators, that shouldn't be our first line of defense. Let's strengthen our laws that say don't possess child pornography, that says don't sexually assault children, say don't sexually assault anyone. Hi, ALV. Glad you're here. Yeah, Davey, and that's the thing about this case is hundreds of the victims didn't remember the assault. You're saying you didn't remember a name. These people didn't even know that they were assaulted. To 20 years later be brought evidence that you were by the police. I mean, for some, it was a godsend. It explained why they were the way they were, and hopefully their healing journey can start in earnest now that they have a reason, a source of why all of these effects have happened throughout their lives. For some, it just brought incredible shame and they're having trouble dealing with it. But I will shout this from the rooftop. There is no victim out there that should feel ashamed, that should feel guilt because of what some predator did to you. All of that belongs on the predator. We have to, as survivors, stand tall. Keep your head up. You did nothing wrong. You were a victim of a predator. Someone who assaults you without your consent, that's not on you. And even if you quote unquote consented, and I think of, a lot of situations where it's a child who doesn't know any better, who has been convinced that this is okay. With one of my abusers, that was the case. And I thought for years I didn't have a right to call myself a victim because I was in on it. I said, okay. Well, I didn't know what I was saying okay to. I was 6. I was manipulated. That's not true consent. As Serge Delmar says all the time in regards to Scientology, kids cannot consent. And it's true. There's a reason why in the United States kids can't enter into legal contracts. They can't consent to that. So I don't really have a whole lot more to say about this case. So it's probably going to be a little shorter of a live tonight. But I felt it was really important to bring this to your attention, to what's going on the global stage, to realize that these issues that we deal with in whatever country you're from, whether it's Canada or Australia or here in the United States, somewhere in Europe, they're not isolated. There's a reason that there's a tourism industry for pedophiles in the Philippines, in Thailand, because they're out there and in much, much, much greater numbers than we realize, than we want to think about. Who wants to realize that their next door neighbor was abusing, has been abusing kids for years, or someone that they work with? It's uncomfortable. We don't like the subject. But that is the exact reason why we have to talk about it. It should not be taboo. It should not be something that we bury our heads in the sand and not look at it. So I encourage each and every one of you listening to this to, at minimum, share this video, share your knowledge, educate anyone you can on trauma effects, on grooming, on what it looks like when someone has been a victim of abuse, of a sexual assault. What do we look for? And educate yourselves and others on how to support those people, because those survivors need a lot of support. I don't know about France, but here in the United States, what I do know of France is the same as in the United States. There aren't built-in services. If the police bring this to your doorstep and say, hey, guess what? We found evidence that you've been abused. They're not also stepping in and saying, hey, here are the services to help you now deal with this issue. Some places may, some states may have some resources, but they're severely underfunded, the ones that are, and severely understaffed. I can't do this on my own, and I can't be an activist everywhere. So I choose my YouTube channel as my way of getting the word out, of educating people. I'm not involved in my local community on this level. I still suffer from effects of my abuse in terms of the depression, anxiety, being overwhelmed. So the thought of trying to get out there and basically sell myself so that I could be a speaker for people and speak to different groups is a little much for me. So this is my avenue to do it. I'm just going back in the chat a little bit. LV says the New Jersey criminal law for sex crimes is actually pretty good. Power lies in the sentencing. Oh, although there's a term of prison, there's a way for the judge to keep them locked up indefinitely. Interesting. Interesting. You know, I find in Michigan with a lot of the cases, because of the way our guidelines are, there's, you know, if the person has been able to get away with it and they have an otherwise clean slate, we have fairly decent prison sentences. But again, it's because of this concurrent sentencing that even if they've been doing it, you know, time after time, and they're brought up on a lot of different charges and they're convicted of all of them, they're allowed to serve those at the same time. To my knowledge, unless there is an issue psychologically here, there's not a way to keep them locked up indefinitely. Again, don't quote me on that because I have not done all the research on it, but to my knowledge, that is the case for Michigan. And I do not know federal laws on this. Amelia, sending you hugs and love. Hugs and love. Carmel did the math. On a 20-year sentence and 300 victims, it's about 15 days per victim. It just doesn't seem right. There's a lot of people calling for a life sentence for them, but they don't have that. They don't have that. So we'll see if they're able to keep the momentum going. Kamal says it's not just in Europe, not just in France. It happens all in every European country. I'm not sure what the it is that you're talking about there, but I imagine if it is just speaking about brushing things under the rug or, you know, the rape culture, it's global. It's global. I mean, the tourism in pedophilia is because the victims, their families, they're so poor that it's the only way to get, it's a way to get money. And it's extremely, extremely sad. Yes, hugs and love, Amelia. Hugs and love. Lots of it sending it to you. Hey, Cosmic, how you doing? Glad you're here. You're awakened. I'm not surprised that you say you still find out more. Suppressing memories, not remembering things, is extremely common. Um, and it was interesting. We've talked about this before in regards to body memories. One of the victims said that she always felt she knew. She didn't. She had no actual memory, but she always felt that something had happened. That's body memories. She didn't have a conscious memory of it, but she felt it somewhere in her soul. And I use that lightly because it is body memories, but it definitely is. It definitely occurs. It explains why people can have memories of something happening to them so young, before we thought we had memories. Actually, there's some fascinating research that's been done right now on terms of memories in kids under 5, and they're finding that they actually do remember things at a much younger age based on their studies that they were doing. It's our recall that is lacking. So that, yes, the memory is there. It's just that we can't recall it like you can remember what you had for dinner last night or the family trip that you took when you were 8 years old. For some reason, that path, it's not made strong enough. Those pathways aren't developed enough. They're still doing research on it, so I'm grasping at straws here as to a reason why you wouldn't have that recall. But that's what it's seeming like. They don't know, they haven't pinpointed like the age at which you stopped. They always felt that you were too young to develop those memories. Now they're finding, no, they developed those memories, but we just can't recall them. Kamal says in the Netherlands, it's a 6-year max, 12 years in severe cases. Damn, that's low. That's really low. Wait, are you talking about for SA or for child pornography? Because I'm reading Davy's comment and that doesn't make sense to me. I think, Davy, you missed a don't in there, or a less for SA. Damn. 6 or 12. So in France, this guy could get 20 years. If the same case was brought in the Netherlands, it looks like he'd be getting 12 years. The amount of cases where I hear where, like for a single victim, regardless of how many acts that they bring, of somebody getting 3 years, 4 years, 2 years, so common. And a lot of times it's because of it's the state's guidelines on it. If you don't have a horrendous past, if you haven't been convicted of a lot of things, that's going to be able to keep your guidelines low in one respect. And depending on what happened in the case, if there wasn't, say, extra circumstances. Wasn't one of these cases that we look at and say it was objectively abhorrent. That's going to keep your guidelines low as well. And a lot of times the judge's hands are tied. Now, in Michigan, you can go outside the guidelines there in certain circumstances. And there needs to be a significantly valid reason for the judge to go outside the guidelines. So in Michigan, if this case was presented and let's say the guidelines showed, 20 years, but you're looking at 300 victims, I do believe that the judge would be justified in saying, no, I'm sentencing you above the guidelines. And it needs to be for a reason, for something that's outrageous, that shocks the conscious. There's various terms of art that they use. I gotta say 300 victims qualifies. Yeah, the justice system is very frustrating. Davey, how long ago was that? So uncle got 6 years for essay of a minor. I'm wondering how long ago that is. Okay, Davey, you didn't miss a word with that. Okay. I was wondering, I'm like, oh, that doesn't really make sense to me. I'm wondering how recent or how far in the past his sentence was. I will say, in a lot of places in the United States, the sentencing has gotten better, but we still have a long way to go. We have to protect the most vulnerable people. We have to demand that non-consensual sexual assault, well, sexual assault by definition is not consensual, but non-consensual sexual acts, let's put it that way. That was in 1990. Okay, it does not surprise me then. It absolutely doesn't. Even if it was today, depending on what the situation was, I would say, and what state it was from, I would say it does not surprise me. Carmel, I've done a lot of research with the Netherlands, and I 100% agree with you. He says punishments have been low in his country as a haven for child pornography and sex trafficking, and it has been for a long, long time. In the 1970s, when child pornography really got kicked off to the masses here in the United States, they were getting their original material from the Netherlands. Frank Sheldon, who was a Michigander, pedophile extraordinaire, before he was able to be brought to justice, when his crimes came to light, he fled to the Netherlands. To my knowledge, either lived out the rest of his life or is still living. I think he died. I think he died in the Netherlands. He was pretty old when he left. But yeah, it was a safe haven, and that's where they were getting their material as movies, home movies, the ability to make videos and take pictures and have them developed yourself, as that became more common for personal use here in the United States, there was a way then to actually generate the content within the United States. And there ended up being a large network, very tangled web, that there were serial killers, serial rapists involved in as well, people were funneling the children to them. They would take the pictures of the video or whatever and send it back. It's a very tangled web, but that's how things grow, right? Just kind of get its tentacles out into everything. and still had strong ties then back to the Netherlands, unfortunately. Frank Sheldon is dead. Okay. He was pretty old when he fled, so I assumed that he would be dead by then. Some people say he was killed, others, but I don't believe it. From all accounts that I have been able to gather on Frank Sheldon, he just moved to the Netherlands and continued making child pornography and distributing it and trafficking children in the Netherlands. Oh, you grew up in California. Interesting. Hi, Mustang Meg. How are you doing? Right, right. Kermel says royalty was involved. Take the case of the Roundhouse. He's speaking of. There has been tangential evidence, not direct evidence, to my knowledge, um, but through witnesses, through people's stories, that um, yeah, this goes up to the highest level. You only need to look at the UK and what became of when cases started breaking there, and the people in Parliament who were exposed. You know, when was that? In the 90s, the 2000s? And you would have thought that there would have been, you know, much more of an uproar, um, but there wasn't. Again, anyone can be an abuser. Their station, their job, their position in life, none of it means that they're, you know, exempt from possibly being abuser. Anyone can. And we need to hold these people accountable. But I know particularly when you talk about people, and it was definitely true in the United States, you know, you've got people willing to cover up for politicians, um, and, you know, do favors back and forth. They end up finding, you know, like-minded people um, to be able to get away with their crimes. And that was certainly the case in the UK when that broke. I forget what they called that when it broke. There was a name they had for it, but it's yeah, there's actually a settlement. I wanted in on it, but I had to be barred in California, and I'm not. But there was just an enormous monetary settlement with in California because of abuse that was happening within the juvenile system, the juvenile detention system out there. Um, so now it's time for the claims to be made as part of the settlement, and I wanted in on that, but I'm not barred in California, unfortunately. Yeah, definitely, Carmel. You know, I've done extensive research on this, and you know, Europe has always been, I don't want to say a hotbed for pedophilia or, you know, sexual assault, but there's a definitive network in place, particularly among people in the higher echelons of society, and it's, you know, just allowed to continue generation after generation. People protecting each other. Um, the Kincora case in Ireland, the gentleman in charge of that boys' school, he had ties to the British government. And while though the British government has investigated twice and has said, no, we did not cover up anything, we find no evidence of criminal activity on his part, personally, I find laughable. Mike says, I think abusive behavior should never be covered up, but it will. And it will unless we allow it not to be. And by what I mean by that is it takes courage on the part of the victims to stand tall, be loud, and not allow what happened to them to be swept under the rug, to not be afraid to speak. But I understand that that's a difficult thing. And depending on who your abuser is, they could have the power to crush you, crush your family financially, make you homeless, whatever the situation is. I understand that it's difficult. And I'm not standing on a soapbox here and saying, therefore, every single victim should, and if you don't, you're, not a good person or anything like that. Absolutely not. If you choose silence, I do not judge, because I understand why you do. Really, education is the key. The more people we have out there, the more eyes we have looking for this stuff, and people not being willing to turn a blind eye because they think, well, it can't be happening there. Not in my backyard. I live in a very, affluent, area, and these people are all very well respected. They couldn't be one of them. Oh, yes, it could. So keep your eyes open. Educate yourself. Educate your neighbor. I talk about it every opportunity I have.